So perhaps one of my earliest memories is a conversation that I had when I was maybe about 4 or 5 with my grandmother. So growing up, I was in between two cultural worlds. My grandparents on my father's side were Muslim, and on my mother's side Tamil. And I had this conversation where I was very sensitive to visual images. And on the musalla, the prayer rug, there was a depiction of the Kaaba, which I was always curious to when I was a kid. And I asked my grandmother one day, "Ma, what is this black square on this rug?" And she said, "Oh, well, that's God's house." So now I'm thinking that's in the neighborhood somewhere. So I asked her, "Oh, okay, where is God's house?" And she said, "Well, it's up in the sky." So I thought about that for a second, and I said, "Okay, how come planes don't hit it?" And she thought about that because I don't think no one had ever asked her that. And she said, "Oh, well, it's very high up." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "And when we all pass away, we all go to God's house." And I say, "Everybody?" And she said, "Yes." And I had a dog called Spike at the time, so I said, "Even Spike?" And she said, "Yes, even Spike," which isn't technically true, I later learned. And she said, "Yes, all of God's creations go to God's house." Now, being a 4-year-old boy, I was extremely excited, and I said to her, "So does that mean there's dinosaurs in heaven?" And this poor woman, who had probably never had this occur to her, said, "Well, I guess by that logic, yes, there's dinosaurs in heaven." And I asked, "Well, won't they eat me?" And no, everybody's friendly there. So, okay. So, from a very early age, I became aware that the world we all share is in fact generated by different models of reality, which are culturally relative, and that the information which constellates those worlds is contingent on the lens through which the looking is done. My grandmother was a good Muslim woman who tried to teach her grandson her beliefs, and I never really bought it because I was always exposed to multiple different perspectives, and I kind of viewed them almost from this third person perspective, even though I was growing up amongst them. And so I became aware of the fact that there's some kinds of information about the world that are invisible in some cultural models and emphasized in others. And this left me with the question, how much of the data that informs our own daily existence is invisible to us? How much can become visible simply through a shift in perspective? The languages that we speak, think in, dream in, all have histories and places of origin. In my case, I struggled to identify with any one cultural model because I found myself caught in between so many. Most South African Indians my age don't speak any indigenous languages, and I became aware of how English as a language represented a history which was in many ways agnostic to the kinds of knowledge encoded in my own ancestral legacy. I began to explore music and instrument making as a means of reconnecting to these lost streams of knowledge. And language here is more than a set of grammatical rules, but to quote National Geographic explorer Wade Davis, language is a watershed of thought. It's an ecosystem of possibility brought into being by human consciousness. Language has direct effects on the kinds of potential that both we as people but also the world can have in terms of how we make sense of that world and how we construct those models of understanding. And I became very interested in what the director of the Art at CERN program, Monica Bello, describes as instrumentation as an extension of the human sensory cortex. So how does technology function as this extension of the human sensory cortex when we have eyes like James Webb, ears like LIGO, CERN's Large Hadron Collider, a 27-kilometer underground ring which collides subatomic particles at near the speed of light to explore the earlier stages of the universe, a LIGO which detects gravitational waves, and James Webb, which is the deepest eyes we have into the past of the universe and our reality. And so as a builder of instruments myself, my concern was not so much how to make quaint but archaic musical instruments. My interest was as to whether I could create a tool which allowed me to access kinds of thinking not facilitated by the languages of thought in my given environment, and whether the new languages of thought offered by the tool could expand or shift my awareness of the information in the environment around me. Music here is being explored as a metaphor for how our relative cultural paradigms enable or disable our ability to access certain phenomena in our environment. The instrument is a philosophical larynx to give voice to soundless things. And I chose music because, in essence, music is an expression of sonic physics, something that I explored extensively at CERN in my conversation with scientists and engineers there, related to how music reflected the underlying structures of reality in particle physics. And that was inspired very much by the kinds of musicians I was listening to at the time, like John Coltrane and Sun Ra. And I became aware interested in how different cultures systematize or organize basically what is natural phenomena in music. So for instance, the piano has 12 notes, whereas in India, the Middle East, and many other places, classical musical systems have as many as 21 or 24 notes. And I realized at 20 that the disparity I experienced as a child, growing up in a world in which I didn't necessarily fit in, was because I was living in a world of only 12 notes when I came from a world of 21. So 5 years ago, I began to build instruments which could access frequencies of sound not accessible on Western instruments as a way of reaching back and reflecting on my own ancestry. But as I followed this trajectory, I discovered that the ancestral system I was trying to reconnect to as an attempt to free my thinking from the model of reality that I inherited was itself just another model and not any truer a reflection of reality. And I realized that actually, if I continue to extend the question of ancestry out into the past, it becomes a cosmological question. So now I found something to identify with, and now I understood who I was and where I belonged in the world because I understood my relationships. Last year on my artist residency with SALT, I saw for the first time the Milky Way. And this was the first time I'd ever seen our galaxy at the age of 25, and it struck me that this is something our ancestors would have seen every single night. And what was especially interesting to me about this place in the Karoo is the fact that it's so dark there that the only light you can see is the light of the Milky Way. And it's so quiet that the only sound you can hear is the sound of your own heartbeat and your throat swallowing saliva. And so this normally invisible relationship in the modern world, which is that of the inner self and the universe in which we live, becomes accentuated in a place like this. And you spend 2 weeks there, as I did, you find that the body also tunes itself to the lack of sensory stimulus. And it was very interesting to discover how the world takes shape when you can't see and you can't hear anything. And of course, it's actually, what I realized is it's not that your senses are being taken away, it's actually that your senses are being heightened. And when you come back to the city, you realize that we're bombarded by noise. And so I became aware and interested of how, just like the telescope that sits on the hills, the body and the mind also need places of silence, no noise, to tune into the universe. So, how much of the information which informs our own daily existence eludes us all the time simply because we're not primed to notice it? How much data gets lost simply because we choose to examine the world through a lens which filters the data away? This year, in collaboration with the South African Astronomical Observatory Optics Lab, I developed a series of exhibitions which explores just this. In Johannesburg, I attempted to transport viewers beyond the event horizon into a void. Within the historic prison complex, Constitution Hill, we bathed the entire complex in a mystical red glow. The glow was meant to symbolize the redshifting of space-time around the region of a black hole. And within a pitch-black room, the only light being generated was by a rainbow, seemingly suspended, floating in space. The observer becomes aware of their body as it attempts to adjust to the dark and silent conditions of the cell. And as visibility increases and the observer moves around the room, everybody is able to discover for themselves a fundamental property of light. Bands of optical wavelengths appear and disappear 360 degrees around the object. The rainbow becomes invisible from one perspective and is instead replaced by scattered rays. Everyone in the room is confronted by the fact that although they are all observing the same object, the object manifests itself relative to their perspective. Colors and lights that are visible from one side of the room are invisible from another. And it is in fact the very act of looking which causes that light to exist, because there must be an eye for that angle to be created. The world is illustrated as a relative thing, where information appears dependent on the perspective which we engage with it. And the only way to create an accurate model of the space is to see it from as many different perspectives as possible. And this is what the artist Olafur Eliasson describes as the space where the world becomes negotiable. In Cape Town earlier this month, we repeated the experiment under more ambitious conditions. And we had, I invited the guitarist Riza Kota to improvise a sonic tapestry as observers were given prisms to create an element of further interaction with the piece. And this exhibition, generated by collaboration, asks the question of how can everyday people, and myself as well, begin to see the significance of cosmology, astronomy, and the work of the SKA and the SAO as something which they too can identify with, for us to collectively recognize the significance that these groundbreaking projects are happening here in South Africa by our own people. How many future scientists, astronomers, thinkers, dreamers of the future are children today waiting for the catalyst of inspiration which sets them on their path? Because, of course, the study of the stars is not a study necessarily of distant space, but actually a study also of distant time. And so as we look further out into space, we are also looking further back into the past. And of course, everything that exists here, the matter of our bodies, the atoms in you and me, come from these distant galaxies. And so for me, this became the kind of ancestral ecology that I wanted to try to understand more deeply. And there's also this element of embodiment, this difference between embodied knowledge versus intellectual knowledge. And there's many cultures around the world which place emphasis on wisdom as opposed to intellectual knowledge, knowing through experience. And so I got really interested in trying to develop instrumentation, which was itself a way where it created an ecosystem of practice, whereby perhaps by practicing with this thing, I can become more sensitive. And what actually I found is that in many ways, it works very similarly to how scientific instruments work. The SALT telescope and the SKA reveal parts of the universe which were otherwise unknown and invisible to us. And the simple act of picking up a guitar can itself also make you listen more keenly to the universe around you. And so this is just a clip from a prototype that I developed a couple years ago that combined sensibilities from traditions of Indian Carnatic music, but also jazz. And so this is just a... This piece is the polyphonic space simulator, an instrument that I designed in 2022 with the help of the engineer Kimesh Chauhan. And this kind of collaboration became really interesting to me, where there's possibilities that exist when we work together that otherwise can't be possible when we're alone. And so this piece is an acoustic electric instrument which synthesized all my influences in jazz, physics, spirituality, and art to develop a kind of ritual object, a 49-stringed, autonomously oscillating instrument, which I debuted in a performance here in Cape Town last November. And the instrument was designed to facilitate a practice of listening. Listening here can be understood as an equivalent of seeing, not just as a sensory thing, but as a literal way of detecting, of cultivating awareness and presence. And it's also an exploration as to how technology aids in human expression. Because here you have a sublimated form of the jazz quartet, where the fourth member of the band is a machine. And so there's this question as to how we as humans collaborate with technology that we create to connect us more deeply to the world and to each other, as opposed to separating us, which often is the effect. And so this is very much a cultural instrument, although it's inspired by scientific concepts. But here it's designed to facilitate an embodied relationship with the ideas from which it comes from. And it's used to create a kind of communal practice of music and improvisation, which further cultivates awareness of self and galaxy. So, as I mentioned, it resonates autonomously, and it's used as a vehicle for improvisation. That's the way I intended it to be used. And we did a performance with it last year with two musicians, actually, who were at this college, Alida and Sean. And so it's this collision of worlds. The upright bass symbolizes the sort of Western classical jazz traditions. The tabla and gatam represent these sort of Indian ancestral worlds, and then the instruments that I developed, which is sort of somewhere in between and somewhere else entirely. But really I was interested in, could these things actually intersect practically? Like, cool, up until now these have all been ideas of mine, these have all been these different concepts, but can we actually just sit and play, which is really what I wanted to do. And so yeah, this was a performance we did at the end of last year. this is just some images of some recent work that I've been doing. A lot of the instruments that I was building in the past were all handcrafted from very organic processes, and often attached to them were very spiritual processes of like fasting. I wouldn't eat certain things. I would practice meditation in certain intervals. There were a whole lot of very instinctual processes which guided the building of the instruments. And something that I was interested to explore was the complete opposite now. Like, how could I implement machine designing, digital designing into the development of instruments, where now we can use machine processes like, CAD systems and CNCs, etc., to develop, and this is an optical system that's being prototyped for the third iteration of Event Horizon. And I think I'll end off there. And to summarize, I would just like to say then that there might be a question as to, because the relationship of these talks and this festival centers around music. And so I would just like to share perhaps some of my perspective on music, which is really, and really a question as well that I ask, I think, in the work that I'm doing, more than it is an empirical claim. And what I was interested, especially at my time in CERN, was when I was speaking to engineers and physicists there, I would throw them my most promiscuous views, hoping that they would be like, no, dude, it's not quite like that. This is actually how it works. But actually what I found was they'd be like, yes, it's exactly like this. So I discovered, for instance, that the way that astronomers can say, oh, that galaxy 10 billion light years away has these elements in it, is because every single molecule in the universe has its own signature refractive pattern in the light wave form. And so I thought, like, oh shit, man, it's like notes. It's like every molecule is like a note. It has a signature key, frequency. And when I asked this to some people, they were like, yes, it's exactly like this. And I asked the question, well, okay, so all matter is energy, and all matter and energy is made from three fundamental building blocks: quarks, gluons, and bosons. They're like, yes, this is true. And so it's like, okay, that's like functional harmony. All meaningful harmony is created from three fundamental triads. And in that performance that I did last year was a composition that I had written, which takes that idea of fundamental harmony triads and the idea of what's called the hyperfine transition of hydrogen, which is where a hydrogen atom electron inverts itself. And when it does that, it releases a photon, and that photon has a 21 centimeter wavelength consistently. And so when people see that 21 centimeter wavelength in space, they know that's hydrogen. And I found that when you translate those concepts to compose pieces of music, it kind of works. Like, you can invert music in the same ways that this photon inverted. And so yeah, instrumentation here is very much looked at not just as a purely scientific thing or a purely cultural thing, but as something in between. How can the instruments that we're developing, these massive projects, actually on the ground level influence the ways we see the world? We still see the world in a very Newtonian way. We still perceive time in very, very linear forms, even though we know that the universe is more complex than this. And so my practice is very much interested in that phenomena. And yeah, I'll end it there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I have a number of questions, and I would like to open the floor to questions as well, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Great. So shall we try the audience first?
I have a very vague question. Firstly, I'm very fascinated by your perception of being human in this physical world manifestation. But now, when it comes to your instrument making, how influenced are you by source vibrations and how that relates to I think you kind of went there a little bit in your ending, but when you now are inspired, you feel the inspiration to create something that is going to create sound and music. What is the kind of thinking or the processing that happens? Because a lot of the two instruments that I saw, the one looks like a guitar, the other one looks like it could have been influenced by a piano kind of thing with a soundboard and strings. And then you have those more like viola, violin type of instruments, or sitar even influenced instruments. So I was just wondering what kind of process happens when you think about how are you going to manifest this item?
So in terms of the musical instruments that I was making, especially the ones that, as you say, represented sitars and guitars and things like this. So I really wanted to play the guitar my whole life and never had one. And I was in art school and I wanted to build myself an instrument, but I couldn't make a guitar because they'd be like, dude, why, this is art school. So I kind of had to dress it up in a concept, but at the same time, it was very much me trying to connect to the fact that I don't speak any languages that my grandparents spoke. And there's ideas and concepts and knowledge about the world. There's a whole worldview in there that's now maybe lost to me to some extent. But maybe that exists in the musical languages. I want to be able to think and to express myself in a language that's not English necessarily. And I felt like music could be the point of access for that. And so those instruments were deliberate attempts at looking at the sort of principles of both the physical mechanics of stringed instruments, especially from India at the time, and places around there, Nepal and Tibet, where those instruments are inspired by. The first instrument was very much inspired by a drumyan, which I had seen. And the first time I saw a drumyan, I was like, wow, this is from a whole different world, And I kind of want to create my own world too. But as I kind of went down that route, I started to build more stringed instruments just because as I built them, I started to understand just the mechanics of how to build a string instrument better. And I was teaching myself, so it was difficult to do at first. And so the instrument you said that looked kind of like a guitar, yeah, it was very much, I was very much interested in, can I create an instrument which sort of spiritually is from a different place, but has the same interface as a guitar, because I'm a guitarist, I'm learning to play the guitar. I don't want to have to relearn a fretboard. It's really complicated. So can I create a fretboard like a guitar, but when I play it, it sounds like it's from a totally different universe. And so that was basically a fretless baritone guitar with sympathetic strings, is how you can think of that instrument. And the larger instrument is really very much just a design based off the principles of how to build a string instrument. So it resembles a piano because I guess a piano is a good design. And when I first built my instruments, I also realized that, like, damn, a sitar is a really good design. It seems difficult if you don't play it, but when you try to build something that improves on the design, you realize they perfected it 200 years ago, when they made that instrument. But actually, to answer your question of, like, how do I perceive that in relation to human and this more cosmic perspective, there I kind of am very interested in this idea that the universe is just made up of frequencies and vibrations. And Coltrane had this idea that, like, he wanted to play so that if someone was sick, he could play some notes and they'd be healed. Or if someone was poor, he could play a different song and wealth would find them. And he had, and that idea is actually quite foundational in, for instance, Carnatic Indian music, where every note is supposed to correlate to a part of the body, and playing the note is very much an act of sort of playing the person, and influencing them. And so I also kind of have this very not scientific imagination of, if you could really just crack music deep enough, you could manifest, you could morph reality, and maybe reality is in itself a kind of manifestation of music, but not the oral music we think of, but vibrations in a more expanded sense. And that's really where that larger instrument came from. I was very interested in the altered states of consciousness that appear when you're improvising, and there's this feeling of, like, I didn't really play that, like, where did that come from? And there's a lot of, ideas and practices around that process, and I thought, there's a lot of cultural and spiritual frameworks around processes of trance, processes of altered states of consciousness. But what if we sort of designed an instrument in the same way we build rocket ships to take us to space? What if we built a technology that assisted with that process? And so that was my attempt at trying to build a technology where ideally this could be a thing that I would interact with on a daily basis. In the same way that my grandmother would pray, this was something that I thought, like, maybe I could interact with this thing and that could deepen my relationship with the instrument that I'm playing, with the world around me. And that's where the sort of optical stuff comes into play as well, because light is also just a waveform. And you can think of it in very similar ways to the way you think of sound in terms of artistically how you might compose with it. And so I was interested in that idea that the entire universe around us transmits us information in the form of waves and is itself manifested as a wave. And so how can the instruments we create, be they musical instruments, be they scientific, etc., fundamentally help us to understand deeper this wave nature of reality, and perhaps allow us to see beyond the veil, beyond the curtain, and understand things more deeply. And in my own experience personally, I just find that a lot of the basic ignorances of the world get immediately dispelled when you just look at that from that context. Like, it's impossible to be prejudiced or bigoted when you see this, well, shit, we come from this distant universe and we're formed from stars. Because the concept is in itself, it doesn't make sense. And I wanted to sort of understand this idea of, okay, we live in these separate cultural paradigms, but how can we create a way of just seeing the world for as it is, as opposed to the way we see it, And yeah, that's still an ongoing process for me at this point.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sorry for the long answer.
May I pose a question?
Please, yeah.
You spoke briefly about improvisation, and I'm interested to, basically to hear how you go about to improvise. What informs your improvisation performance practice?
So that's definitely something that I don't feel like I have answers to, in the sense that I'm still trying to figure it out. But I know that I've had many glimpses of what I would consider like the true improvisation, whatever that might be. And I almost kind of take maybe a kind of like a Zen attitude towards it, in the sense that to understand it defeats what it is. It's a paradox, because it's the state of non-thinking or non-being in which there's this very true sense of being. So to think about it, you can't do it, almost. And when you're doing it, you're not really thinking about it. And so I've been doing martial arts since I was a child, and there are a lot of moments in there where I feel like there's lessons I learn in improvisation there that translates to music, where you can't prepare for a fight. Well, you can't premeditate the moves you're actually going to do in that fight before you go in it, because it doesn't work. But you can enter a state where it almost seems like Bruce Lee talks about it as, when the time comes, you don't hit, it hits all by itself. Right. And it's this kind of flow state where you're almost behaving and acting beyond your actual capacity to act. And I felt like that was something I encountered even as a small child, where I'd draw something, but it was way better than anything I could ever draw. And if I would try to recreate it, I never could, except for that one moment where there was this just pure creation happening. And yeah, I've been very curious about that phenomenon. And I have this hypothesis that perhaps actually what that is really just the ego separates us from the world, when there really is no separation. And in those moments of pure inspiration, we become what we really are, which is just one manifestation of this infinite universe. And so we have the same creative capacity as the universe, which is infinite creative capacity. And yeah, I think those states maybe touch on that. That's my hypothesis anyway. It's not a scientific one, but I've been very curious about what that thing is in improvisation and how to master it, because I've encountered people who seem to master it and they have their own theories for what it is. It seems nobody really knows what it is. Everybody has their own understanding of it, but there also does seem to be ways to be better at it, of switching it on, turning on that button. So my approach to improvisation, I would say, very much just takes the attitude of trying to empty oneself and one of the engineers at CERN was an improvisational theater actor, and he gave me the 3 rules of improvisational acting, which I thought translates perfectly. And those rules are: bring a brick, not a cathedral. What were the 3 rules? Bring a brick, not a cathedral. Make your partner look good. And the 3rd rule, I can't remember it for some reason. Yeah, I can't remember it. I told someone this yesterday.
Well, those 2 rules in themselves are already...
They're good, yeah. Why can't I remember the 3rd one? Bring a brick, not a cathedral. Make your partner look good. And the 3rd rule was that was the best rule. Wow.
All the more reason to invite you back. For that.
Sure, yeah. I'll come with the 3rd rule next time.
Indeed.
Cool.
Bongo. Sorry, Bongo. Could you step up to the microphone, please?
Sure. Hi, man.
Hey.
Yeah, amazing talk, really inspiring. I think I don't know if it will morph into a question, it's really a comment, but talking about improvisation, because I'm also a jazz musician. I'm actually, in my dissertation, I'm talking particularly about improvisation and the, I guess, improvisation from a ritualistic sense. And I think you brought up how, I guess, instruments can allow us well, instruments can function as almost a thing that allow us to, when we have gotten rid of our, I guess, ego, to tap into the, I guess, universal consciousness, and I guess the link between that and prayer and meditative states and altered states. This is really interesting to me. So I guess my question will be, do you think that what instruments allow us and what is the ability to improvise, which is in of itself an ability to connect with other people, and to through that a connection to the ancestors of other people, and through that a connection to the universal consciousness. This is very value-added because I'm still processing everything that you've said, but I guess that's probably the gist of my question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to answer that, like, it is a very tricky question even to ask, let alone answer, because it can get very wishy-washy very quickly. But I think there really is a real thing here, you know, like when we start using, like, this is impossible to describe it almost, because it's such an enigma even when you're doing it. So we sort of try to come up with things like, it's universal consciousness, or it's the ancestors, and these are very much for me like the cultural terms we might try to prescribe to this massive, incomprehensible force, you know, that we can tap into as people. And yeah, I think that the whole ritual aspect of music is definitely something which I tried to pay a lot of attention to. I'm not so much interested in playing in a big concert and having like, I'm really interested in the power of music to move and transform human beings and cultures, and also possibly affect the world around us, because vibrations physically affect the world. And how you can do that when you tailor it with specific intentions, you know. And the idea that, like, I guess, there's a very different attitude to singing a song because it's going to chart a billboard and you're going to play it and make $1 million, versus singing a song to help a laboring mother birth a child. And both of those are sort of cultural contexts in which music exists, but with very different attitudes, and then I think also very different outcomes. And a lot of those things, I think, with improvisation, it's really just birthed from presence in the moment and being aware of the moment. And it's a very difficult thing to describe. I mean, that's why I built a whole instrument that's meant to be like a technology that you press a button to and helps you get there. Because I wanted to create a practice of it, as opposed to, putting it in a bottle and saying, okay, cool, this is what this thing is. It's more about, can I just experience it and make it part of me more, and see what that does, to my consciousness and my psyche, and how then I affect others. And then again, yeah, I think a large part of that very much is a communal aspect of how we connect, why we play with other musicians, as opposed to playing with ourselves. And in what context? Are we playing in a club? Or are we playing around a fire? Or are we playing, And those things also, I think, also change the music and how we play, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I guess it's something that's, like you say, it's so hard to really get to the core of, but...
On that note, Kamil, thank you so much for making time for us, for spending time with us. And please consider this an open invitation to come and perform at the College of Music on your instruments, to share with us your insights, because I think you have a very unique point of view, a pedestal, not a pedestal, but a position from which to perform answers to very deep, fundamental questions. And that is something very, very precious. So you must please come back. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.